All right, so strap yourselves in because we're going deep into cyber espionage today. Specifically, a group called Salt Typhoon. And, the stuff you guys sent in on these guys, it's wild. Like, it's right out of a spy movie. We're talking infiltrating super secure networks, grabbing all sorts of sensitive data, and get this, they might even be messing with, legal surveillance.
It really is amazing how these groups, Salt Typhoon are also called Earth Estuaries or Ghost Emperor UNC 2286, how they managed to stay hidden for so long. They've been active since I think at least 2020, and they're all over the world, from these huge telecom companies to government agencies, even critical infrastructure shows you how much the whole cyber threat scene is changing,
hmm
right?
Yeah, it's not just about, stealing files anymore. It's like they want access, they want to influence things, maybe even disrupt, like the systems we depend on every day. So let's get right to it. You pointed out some recent stuff they did that really kind of set off alarm bells. Salt Typhoon, they hit those big U.S. telecom companies, AT&T, Verizon, Lumen Technologies, T-Mobile, big names, right? Yeah. What's the big deal with that?
Just think about all the info that goes through those networks, right? Call logs, messages, sensitive data, all that's gold for espionage. I mean, these breaches, they could have huge consequences, messing with markets, influencing elections, even getting into people's private stuff.
Yeah, not a good thought. And Salt Typhoon, they seem to be everywhere, right? I mean, in your research, you mentioned stuff happening in the Asia Pacific, the Middle East, even South Africa. Is
Yeah.
there like a pattern to who they go after, or are they just kind of casting a wide net?
Well, their targets are all over the place, yeah. But they do seem to focus on whoever's got strategic value, government agencies, that kind of critical infrastructure stuff, energy, transportation, research places, even media organizations. They're looking for information and tech that gives them an advantage.
So how do they do it? How do they break into these networks that are supposed to be like super secure? What's their playbook?
They're very sophisticated, let me tell you. Zero-day vulnerabilities, they use those. Basically, flaws in software that the developers don't even know about yet. That's why keeping your systems patched is so important. But that's not all. Custom-made malware, too, and they often use this technique called living off the land.
Living off the land. Okay, that sounds kind of interesting, but I'm not sure I get it. Could you explain that a bit?
So it's like this, they use legitimate tools, the kind that are already on the system, but they use them for, malicious stuff. Think of it like a burglar using your own tools to break into your neighbor's house. Makes it way harder to track them.
Wow, that's sneaky. Okay, so let's say they get in. What then? What do they do once they're inside these networks?
Well, it depends, but a lot of times they'll set up backdoors to keep that access for the long haul, rootkits to hide themselves, and tools to, get that data out. We're talking some serious malware here.
hmm
Stuff like Ghost Spider is a modular backdoor that can change depending on the situation. And they've been linked to Snappy B2, that's a modular backdoor that looks like it's being shared by a few different Chinese APT groups.
Wait, hold on. Shared, so it's not just Salt Typhoon doing their own thing. You're
Yeah.
saying there's a possibility of like a network of these groups all working together, sharing resources.
Yeah, it seems that way, which makes the whole thing even scarier. And the tools they use are, well, they're advanced. Take Demodex, for example. That's a rootkit, so basically a stealth tool that lets them control servers remotely without anyone knowing.
So it's not just grab and go data theft. They're maybe setting up shop for long-term spying, even causing disruptions.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. They've gone after those lawful intercept systems, the systems law enforcement use for wiretaps. That really raises the stakes.
Hold on. You're saying they're targeting the tools that are meant to track them down.
Yeah.
What are the implications of that?
Well, it might mean that they're not just after information. They could be trying to mess with investigations, find out who's under surveillance, even, tamper with evidence. Imagine the chaos if they could change or delete important data.
Okay, so we've talked about how they do it, who they target. But who is Salt Typhoon, really? We know there's this link to the Chinese government, but what does that actually mean? Are we talking official agents or some kind of secret group?
It's hard to say for sure who's behind these cyber attacks. There's rarely a smoking gun, and countries can easily deny any involvement. But the level of sophistication here, the resources they're using, it points to a well-funded, really organized group.
So maybe not some teenagers in their basement, but
Mhm.
not officially the government either.
Right. It's likely they're operating with some sort of government backing, even if it's just, a nod and a wink, maybe even getting directions from higher up.
So like a digital army working in the shadows, doing the state's bidding. This is getting into some serious cloak and dagger territory. Now, I know you've also got some information on how the U.S. government
Yeah.
is responding to this. Should we get into that now or save it for later?
Let's save that for later. We still need to unpack some of the ways Salt Typhoon keeps their grip on these networks once they're in.
Okay, sounds good. We'll dive into the U.S. government's countermeasures in the next part. But for now, listeners, let that sink in. We're talking about a group that's sophisticated, well-funded, maybe state-backed, and they can break into the most secure networks. They even target the systems trying to track them. It's about to get even more interesting, so stay tuned.
So yeah, let's dig a little deeper into some of the tricks Salt Typhoon uses that make them so hard to, spot and stop. We talked about that living off the land thing before, but there's more to it than just using those everyday tools.
Yeah, you said they use them for bad stuff, but I'm still not quite clear on how that actually works. Can you give us, like, a real-world example?
Sure. Let's say they want to move around inside a network, like jump from one computer they've already got to another one. Instead of using some custom malware that might set off alarms, they could use a tool that's built in, like Windows Management Instrumentation Command Line, WMIC. It's a legit system admin tool, so using it might not raise any eyebrows.
So they're basically hiding in plain sight, making it harder for those security systems to pick them out, like a chameleon blending in.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And they don't stop there. They use PS2, another legit tool, to run commands remotely on other systems in the network. By using these built-in things, they stay under the radar and can be more sneaky.
Yeah, that's pretty smart, I gotta say. But at some point, they need to get that stolen data out, right?
Yeah.
How do they manage to move all that info without anyone noticing?
That's where their command and control setup comes in. It's pretty elaborate. They set up layers of servers, proxies, often using hack machines from, you know, unsuspecting people, to send that stolen data back to their home base.
So it's not just a straight line from the victim's network to Salt Typhoon. They're bouncing it around, making it harder to trace back.
Right. It's like a complicated game of digital hopscotch
Yeah.
meant to cover their tracks and make it tough for investigators to follow the data.
This is starting to sound less like spies and more like a high-tech heist movie. But even with all this sneaking around, they got to leave some kind of trail, right? Don't those security researchers eventually find clues and figure out what happened?
Of course, they leave some traces. Nothing's perfectly invisible, but Salt Typhoon, they're careful. They delete log files, wipe stuff from those compromised machines, even use self-destruct stuff in their malware to erase their activity.
So it's like they're cleaning up the crime scene before anyone even knows a crime's been committed.
Yeah.
But even with all that, they must make mistakes sometimes.
Yeah. They do, and that's how researchers and intelligence agencies learn about their methods and figure out how to fight back. One way we've learned about Salt Typhoon is by looking at their malware.
So by studying the digital fingerprints they leave behind, we can understand how they work and find ways to stop them.
Exactly. Analyzing their malware code, we see patterns, their command and control setup, even get an idea of what they're after. And that brings us back to that malware we talked about earlier. Remember Ghost Spider?
Yeah, the one that can adapt to different situations, the modular backdoor, it sounded pretty advanced.
It is. And that modular design is a key thing. It lets Salt Typhoon tweak the malware for specific targets and environments, making it more effective and harder to detect.
So it's like a Swiss Army knife for hacking, with different tools for different jobs. What about Snappy, though? You mentioned it was shared by a few different Chinese groups. What's the big deal with that?
The fact that they're sharing these tools is worrying. It suggests they're working together, maybe even being directed by someone higher up to push their cyber espionage goals.
So we're not just dealing with one rogue group, but maybe a whole network of actors working together, sharing what they know and their resources. That's a little unsettling, to say the least.
It is, and it shows how complex this challenge is. It's not just about stopping one group. It's about dealing with a whole ecosystem of cyber espionage.
This is getting pretty heavy.
Yeah.
We've gone from like shadowy hackers to maybe a network of state-backed groups, advanced malware, and attacks on those lawful intercept systems. Is there any good news here?
There is. The U.S. government is taking this threat seriously. They've put several things in place to counter Salt Typhoon and those other state-sponsored hacking groups.
Okay, let's switch gears then and talk about how they're fighting back. What's the U.S. government doing to deal with this threat?
One of the main things is patch management. They've put out a bunch of alerts through agencies like CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, telling organizations to patch those vulnerabilities we talked about. Specifically, they're saying to fix weaknesses in systems like Avanti Connect Secure VPN, Fortinet FortiClient EMS, Sophos Firewall, and Microsoft Exchange Server.
So like plugging the holes in the dam before it breaks. But what about those zero-day exploits, the ones nobody knows about yet? How do they defend against those?
That's where advanced threat detection comes in. They're putting money into AI-powered tools that can look at network traffic for anything unusual, and they're pushing for continuous monitoring to catch those subtle living off the land tactics that might slip through.
Like having a 24/7 security team watching for anything suspicious? I bet that kind of technology is expensive though, right? And complicated.
It can be, but getting hacked would cost way more than investing in security. And the government is working to make those technologies available to everyone, no matter how big or small.
That's good to hear. But tech alone can't solve everything, can it? What about the human factor? People make mistakes, click on bad links, fall for those phishing scams. How are they addressing that?
You're right, the human element is key. That's why they're focusing on training and awareness programs. It's about teaching people about the risks, showing them how to spot those phishing attempts, and building a culture of cybersecurity in organizations.
So creating a human firewall, along with a tech one. But even with all that, doesn't it feel like we're always playing catch up? Salt Typhoon keeps changing, coming up with new tactics, finding new ways to exploit weaknesses. How do we get ahead of them?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a constant race, and there's no magic bullet. But one important thing is collaboration. The government is encouraging private companies and agencies like the FBI to share information.
Right, because if everyone shares what they know and their resources, we have a better shot at staying ahead. It's like a global immune system for the digital world.
Exactly. And they're also pushing for international rules and agreements on cyber behavior. The goal is to have clear rules and hold countries accountable for what they do online.
So it's not just about tech and defense. It's about diplomacy, working together internationally, and setting clear boundaries in the digital world. Like, it's the Wild West out there, and we need some law and order.
That's a good way to think about it. It's a new frontier, and we're still figuring out the rules.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? We're up against a tough opponent in Salt Typhoon, and the threat is always changing. Is there any hope of staying safe in this digital world that's getting more complex all the time? So we've really dug deep into this whole Salt Typhoon thing, from their, sneaky tactics to how countries might actually work together to fight back. But the big question for me is, what's next? Is this just going to be this endless back and forth, or can we actually turn the tables?
Yeah, that's a big question everyone's asking, in the cybersecurity world. It's a tough one. I think there are reasons to be worried, but also some reasons to be, hopeful.
Okay, let's break that down. Why the worry?
Well, the threat is always changing, right? Groups like Salt Typhoon, they're adaptable, resourceful. They're always coming up with new techniques, finding new weaknesses to exploit, staying ahead of the security measures. It's like a constant arms race. Hard to say what they'll do next.
So it's like we're always one step behind, never really knowing where the next attack will come from. Definitely makes you cautious. But what about the hopeful side? Where do you see things getting better?
Well, one thing is more people are aware now. More organizations, individuals, they get how serious this cyber threat is. And they're starting to do things to improve their security.
Right, we talked about patching, better threat detection, training employees, all important stuff. But is it enough to just, play defense?
Defense is crucial, yeah, but it's not the whole story. We need to be more proactive. Disrupt their infrastructure, expose what they're doing, make it harder and riskier for them to operate.
So a bit of offense with the defense. But how do we do that without making things worse? Maybe even starting a bigger conflict?
It's a tough balance, for sure. It takes a multi-pronged approach. Things like economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, even legal action against those involved in these activities. It all can play a role.
So it's not just about tech fixes. It's about using everything we've got, like diplomacy, international law, to make the digital world safer.
Exactly. And I think one of the most promising signs is that countries are cooperating more. They're realizing that these cyber threats, they don't stop at borders, and they're working together to share information, come up with strategies, and hold those responsible accountable.
Yeah, that makes sense. If everyone's working together, sharing intel, coordinating their actions, it's got to be harder for these groups to operate, without consequences, like a global neighborhood watch, but online.
Right. And I think that's where the real hope is. By working together, sharing what we know, our resources, setting clear rules for online behavior, we can make the digital world safer and more resilient.
So for our listeners, what should they take away from all this? It sounds like there's reason to be both concerned and optimistic, but what can they actually do in this complex world?
Stay informed. Know the threats, the tactics, what could happen. Don't be complacent. Take steps to protect yourself, your data, your devices.
The basics, right? Strong passwords, watching out for phishing, keeping software up to date. What about businesses, though? What can they do?
It's about having layers of security, strong technical controls, invest in that advanced threat detection, but don't forget the people. Train your employees, make sure everyone's aware of cybersecurity, and stay vigilant.
Sounds like a lot, but it's clear that this is serious stuff. Cybersecurity isn't just an IT problem anymore, it's important for businesses, national security, and in the end, it's everyone's responsibility.
Absolutely. It's something we all need to be thinking about and doing something about.
Well said. Listeners, this deep dive into Salt Typhoon has been really eye-opening. It's a complex and evolving threat, but we can't ignore it.
That's right. And remember, we focused on Salt Typhoon today, but they're just one example of the many sophisticated cyber threats out there. The takeaway is to be aware, be prepared, and take action.
Great advice. And remember, keep sending in those fascinating deep dive requests. We love exploring the depths of knowledge with you. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode and found it valuable. If you did, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. It really helps us reach more amazing listeners like you. Thanks again for your support, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Bye for now.